Calico Yorkie is alive. That's right, you thought it was death, but it was me, life. And we're going to go over Oda's original plan for Yorkie, as well as how and why that changed, how it fits into Brook's secret history at a certain kingdom, how Yorkie survived, and his connection to Yori, as well as other things, so many other things. This is a much longer video than I anticipated it would be because I keep finding stuff. But the idea that Yorkie may have survived is not a new one. In fact, pretty much the only time that anyone talks about Calico Yorkie is in regards to his potential survival, which has resulted in every possible incarnation of thought being processed, including 11 years ago on Reddit when there was a particularly wild theory that Yorkie was actually Admiral Greenbull and that Brook would have some sort of relationship to all Marine Admirals due to the rampant speculation that he is also Kuzan's grandfather or something along those lines. And we've also heard crazy ideas that Yorkie's ship was destroyed by a Sea King he washed up on Amazon Lily, and that's where Gloriosa fell in love with him and why she betrayed the Kuja tribe by leaving the island to join the Rocks Pirates with the purpose of searching for Yorkie. Every theory that can be posed has been posed. And up until now, I've mostly been in the camp that this boy is dead, and that Oda wanted to give him more of an artistic hero's farewell rather than see him die in excruciating pain, coughing and spluttering until death. However, Robin's reunion with one Jaguar D-Sol has changed my thinking of this because deaths are no longer up for artistic interpretation. We live in an age where we need to see them bodies. And in addition to this, the reappearance of Geen with Don Krieg also reinforces my thinking, because Geen was in a very similar position to Yorkie. Geen was poisoned and pretty much guaranteed to die, so he heroically set off into the distance, never to be seen again until he was. So I can't bring myself to accept Yorkie's death at face value anymore. There's no guarantees. And Yorkie is an often forgotten about but very intriguing existence because he's one of Oda's earliest characters, appearing way back in chapter 103, with his eventual exploration delivering a brash, lovable protagonist of his own story, with characters on his face that strongly resemble the Japanese katakana yo, but arguably also look like the tail of a musical note. And Yorkie also has a surprise connection to a certain Yori. Yorkie's full name is often mistaken as Calico Yorkie, an error that I myself have made in the past, but the Calico part is actually his epithet, and it's a name inspired by the real-life pirate Calico Jack, who got that epithet due to his preference for calico clothing, which gives 18th century piracy a distinctly RuPaul's Drag Race vibe. Now, Calico Jack had an affair with Anne Bonny, the inspiration for Yori Bonny, and at one point this affair, mate, it got so steamy that Jack offered to buy Bonny in a practice described as divorce by purchase. However, her husband refused. But then Bonny just up and ran away with Jack for free, which, bargain. But as a result of this, there used to be a very prominent theory that this connection was kept in mind by Oda and that the two had crossed paths at some point, with Bonny making Yorkie young again through her devil fruit abilities. However, we've since learned that Bonny's abilities are permanently temporary and highly subject to her own imagination and belief. So that connection is down the toilet, but Yorkie's death was left extremely vague. On one of his voyages, Yorkie contracted a disease that looks suspiciously like the tree fever encountered by Noland on Jaya, and it's even been said that Yorkie caught it after exploring a forest-type thing, with the crew doctor stating they must have contracted it in the jungle they stopped by. I've never seen anything like it. None of my treatments work. Although if it was a jungle, then it also sounds similar to Nami's 5-day disease, which she picked up on Little Garden. I doubt that it is the 5-day disease, but that case may explain why the Rumbar Pirates doctor had no cure for Yorkie's condition. In the case of 5-day disease, Nami was fatefully lucky that Dr. Kureha had lived long enough to predate the reported eradication of the disease, so she still had a supply of vaccine available just in case. But if it was tree fever, which is much more likely, then that was a condition 400 years ago. And if it was thought to be eradicated sometime between then and now, then modern fictional doctors would not be equipped to treat it, because the cure is oddly specific. You need to source a special substance known as konin from kona trees. And even if you know what disease you're fighting and how to treat it, then you'd still need to know where to find a kona tree before this disease kills Yorkie and all of the other crew members. However, the fact that it is possible means that Yorkie could have survived, no matter how slim those chances are. But the condition itself was not the only challenge he faced for survival. Also, this video is brought to you by a paid partnership with BetterHelp, a platform designed to connect you with a licensed therapist trained to listen and provide you with helpful, unbiased advice. Therapy is something that anyone can benefit from, and for me, it's always been about personal growth and problem solving. It really helps me to get an outside perspective to better understand my own habits as well as develop healthier ones, and finding more effective ways to solve problems that will improve my emotional well-being, which BetterHelp does very effectively effectively, and it's incredibly easy to start. You just fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And I know in our very on-demand world, a couple of days, it sounds like an eternity, but the reality is that finding a therapist in real life, like over there, that could take me months, and that's if I'm lucky. With over 7,000 reviews and a 4.5 rating on Trustpilot, BetterHelp makes sure that therapists on the platform are well qualified, and if you're matched with one that doesn't feel like quite the right fit, then no worries, that's very common, and you could easily switch to another therapist that you can really connect with. The whole idea of BetterHelp is to make the journey of starting therapy easier, and I found it to be an absolutely brilliant resource that caters to my lifestyle, which not a lot of things do. So if you think you might benefit from a therapy session, then click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/grandlinereview for a 10% discount on your first month of therapy. So give BetterHelp a go and see if it's the right fit for you. But for now, it's back to you, me. The condition itself was not the only challenge he faced for survival, because Yorkie also took the infected portion of the Rumbar Pirates and tried to escape the Grand Line by sailing through the Calm Belt. And some of Yorkie's last words were, "We can't risk the infection spreading. The rest of the crew and I will try to exit the Grand Line via the Calm Belt. We're not giving up yet." Now again, I've generally weighed in more on the side of this being a romantic portrayal of death. Oda literally shows us Yorkie sailing off into the sunset, never to be seen again. But I also thought the same thing about Saul. As much as his death was never viscerally depicted, it seems like another romantic take on the end of a man's life. So with Saul and the aforementioned Geen surviving, this does throw Yorkie into question for me. And he's not the only one either, because there's a couple of other key flashback characters that we don't see die but have been assumed to be dead, like Tom. The last shot we see of him is a close-up being taken away on the sea train, and he was then presumably executed at any slobby ? I don't know. Who knows? We don't see anything like a newspaper article announcing his death. It's all just assumptions. And just like Saul, there has been some controversy over whether or not to have Tom in the dead category of the One Piece wiki. And if you go to the ever so reliable talk section, then you'll see that an editor named Galaxy 9000 has posed the question of whether or not we know for a fact that Tom's dead, which I've discovered is the best way to start a fight on the One Piece wiki, because after this, another editor named Dance Powder snapped back with, "We have confirmed this. He was either executed as ordered or bled out beforehand. Please don't turn this into another Sabo fiasco. Frankie and Iceberg both said he was dead, and there is nothing to suggest otherwise." And at this point, I'd argue that there's almost equally as little to suggest that he is actually dead. It's all assumptions, and neither Frankie nor Iceberg are reliable narrators. Because if you'd asked Robin whether or not Saul was dead, she would have said, "Yep, saw the dude get frozen myself." But back to Yorkie, the fact that even at the very end he wasn't giving up is a big point in his favor. Because One Piece is a series about willpower that can be quantified into actual fist-punching power. And right before departing, Brook also says that this doesn't have to be the end and that they'll reunite again. So both Brook and Yorkie had the will to make this happen. They refused to say goodbye. And we only know how one half of that story turned out, with Crocus alleging to know the second half. "Those pirates who left you in my care have fled the Grand Line. I know they were your friends and they made you a promise, but they're never coming back." Which was information that Crocus hadn't discovered firsthand. No, this comes from his quote, "reliable source." But if Crocus didn't see it himself, then this conclusion is still questionable, and Crocus goes on to say that, "I'm afraid reality is even crueler than fiction." And to that I say, luckily for us, this pirate comic is fiction. And Oda will often deliberately cut back on cruelty because he has that power as an author. And so here I think that one of two things happened. What you're looking at on screen right now is what I call the Straw Hat Blueprint. This was a guide sketch that Oda did for the crew composition when the series began. This was made as a guiding star and one that got derailed pretty quickly. I mean, just look at Usopp, what's happening here? But this blueprint provides us with fantastic insight into Oda's goals. And if we look at his guiding star for Brook, what we see is a funky cowboy skeleton, which is likely the reason why Yorkie and half the Rumbar Pirates retain that cowboy aesthetic. And so it's very possible that the figure from chapter 103 that we see and now know as Yorkie was originally supposed to be Brook, because his face is deliberately masked, at least in the manga. In the anime, they kept nothing vague at all and even gave us a very detailed close-up of his face, which doesn't look unlike Oda's final Yorkie design and may even have been the inspiration of continuity for it. But back at the time that Oda was drawing chapter 103, I think it's very possible that the character he drew was Brook, because the actual Brook is is nowhere to be seen. And if there was a different intention for him, then he should be somewhere in the background of the Rumbar Pirates panels in chapter 103. And when we do get to Thriller Bark, these background panels are shown again, but they have been retconned to show Brook standing smack bang in the middle. So somewhere along the line, Oda made the choice to separate Brook from this drawn entity. And one explanation for that is that Yorkie has a greater purpose to fulfill down the line. Oda had a better idea of how to use this setup, and so he created Yorkie to plant another seed, and so he may very well be someone that we encounter again in the future. The other explanation is what I'm going to call the more pessimistically real one, which is that there was no real plan, ever. Just because we knew that Brook existed in Oda's mind from the beginning doesn't mean that Laboon and the Rumbar Pirates were always meant to be his setup. For all we know, these guys in chapter 103 were never meant to be named or referenced ever again. They were just props, warm, fleshy props to tell a sad whale story that Oda went on to recycle and repurpose later on. And that's why Yorkie had to exist. Because Oda needed to link Brook to Laboon, but also make sense of what Crocus originally said about the crew fleeing the Grand Line. And the only way to do that was to basically create two crews, then have one half fulfill the original Crocus continuity, and have the other implement the tragic yet beautiful ideas that Oda thought up later for Thriller Bark. I believe that's the most likely explanation, because I think that Oda gets far too much credit for foreshadowing, and nowhere near enough credit for improvising. His real skill is improvising. Using the pieces that he sort of haphazardly put on the board in ways that he never could have dreamed of at the time. And that's a big part of why the Yorkie being alive theory still works for me. Because even if this guy was meant to be a functional, expendable character 2 times over now, Oda has still left room for Yorkie to be back should that inspiration strike at just the right moment. And it's not just Yorkie that's been left wide open as if Hachiro Oda grew up in a barn, because there is also a gaping chasm in Brook's backstory just waiting to be filled. As Brook has a secret history prior to the Rumbar Pirates that has only been mentioned once. Long ago, I was the leader of a battle convoy in a certain kingdom. After that, I served with the Rumbar Pirates as a musician swordsman and later stepped in as the captain. So before he was a pirate, Brook was a soldier. In fact, he had a whole career as a soldier on a quote, certain kingdom, and saying certain kingdom is a lot like when Oda says that man. It generally means that this is too important to spoil, so we're going to keep it vague. And the current leading hypothesis on this certain kingdom is that it's called Taroa, a region of West Blue, just so happens to be where Brook and all of the Rumbar Pirates are from. But also, this man who you may or may not remember from the Human Auction House, his name is Byron, and he was being sold for his phenomenal skills as a musician. And not only that, but Byron was said to have been from a long line of musicians that hail from the Taroa kingdom. And the starting bid for Byron was the quote, a special price of 480,000 berries, which is the equivalent of 48 Doskoi Panda t-shirts, which isn't bad. Doskoi Panda is a luxury brand in the One Piece world after all. But a kingdom of music struck many people as quite interesting back in the day, simply because of how heavily Luffy himself focuses on music. Getting a musician was his #1 priority as a crew member long before the essential to stay alive roles, and this idea has only continued to grow over the years, with the advent of the drums of liberation and the ever-growing relevance of Bing Sasake, which was Yorkie's favorite song. And going back to Byron, his clothing very much resembles Brook's as well as half of the Rumbar Pirates, because that crew had a very stark complementary aesthetic going on, with half of them dressed like classical musicians and the other half dressed like cowfolk. It's not just music and aesthetics that we have to make this connection though, because there's also a third thing, a thing so ridiculous, which is this color spread of Brook playing music with a bunch of grasshoppers, except you fool, they're not grasshoppers, they are leafhoppers, and a particular genus of this leafhopper in question is known as a Taroa. And as far as we're aware, the Taroa in the Taroa kingdom is not referring to a Japanese word, because it's written in katakana, meaning that it's a loan word. The Japanese, they stole it, they came into your house, they stole your word. And look, I'm willing to accept that this is a wild coincidence and that Oda has never even heard of the Taroa before, but also the man is an avid zoologist and is infinitely curious about the world around him, so I wouldn't put it past Oda. And in addition to the clothing and the focus on music, that is 3 things, and 3 is the amount of connections that I personally require to start taking ideas somewhat seriously. All of the leaf hoppers in this color spread also have Brook's Jolly Roger on their hats, and they're performing in their own little leaf hopper kingdom. Again, this could be utter madness, but the fact is that we are missing a very key part of Brook's history, which is what inspired him to become a pirate in the first place. That's a pretty big question. We know why everyone else became pirates, and other Straw Hats do have unanswered questions, but they mostly revolve around parents. Who were Nami's true parents? Who are Frankie's true parents? Could be Queen. But all those questions can afford to go unanswered due to the found focus family of the series. But Brook is in a very different situation. There is no other Straw Hat who has a Void Century style blackout in their personal history, and to get all the way back to the point of this video, exploring that gap may be why Yorkie is being kept in the oven and narratively slow cooked to perfection for the eventual Brook banquet that our story stomachs demand. And a lot of the questions surrounding Yorkie's survival tend to revolve around logistics. How did he sail through the Calm Belt safely? How did the disease not kill him? How did it get cured? Who cured it? Why? But stuff like this is all pretty irrelevant. If we're talking about real life history, then sure, this matters a lot. You gotta think about these things logically, but Oda can come up with pretty much anything to satisfactorily explain these sorts of things. Again, he's a ridiculously good improviser, and there's only a handful of cases where these gap-filling explanations have been unsatisfactory to me. And even if they are unsatisfactory. For example, for me personally, Sabo's amnesia is a pretty weak explanation for not knowing about Ace and Luffy and being alive at the same time. But it doesn't matter because weakness aside, Oda still did it. So even if the logistics are a bit shaky, that's not going to stop Yorkie or quite frankly anyone surviving if that's what Oda wants, which is the sort of thinking that I try to impart in these videos. You can't afford to think of fictional pirates in logical ways. You've got to think more emotionally, which is why the more important question I have, and I think this is much harder to answer, is if Yorkie is alive, then why didn't he go and visit Laboon? I think that's definitely much harder to answer than logistics. And if he did survive, then right now Yorkie would likely be about the same age as Brook, which is 90, which yes, does sound quite old, but according to Oda, the average human in the One Piece world lives to around 140, so it's not out of the question statistically. But in all of that time, in these past 52 years, like, go and see your whale friend. It's fine to not go and see Brook because, you thought he was dead for half a century, but Laboon is still there. Unless what happened to Yorkie was a fate similar to that of Brook. And Yorkie's path to survival could have seen him stranded and stuck somewhere for the last 50 years like Brook was. Yorkie could have been, or even is currently on an isolated island in the Calm Belt with no way of escaping, because even if you could build a ship or have your old ship, it's not like you can actually sail it in the Calm Belt. No wind, mate. Or the other option is that Yorkie could have been very active, and this could be a very One Piece solution, which is that Yorkie refused to go and see Laboon until he could reunite with Brook to properly fulfill their promise, or some sort of, emotional crap like that. Oda's very good at writing that sort of stuff and making it hit hard. I am not. And just like Robin and Saul, I think it would go down pretty well with the readers. In fact, it may even go over a lot better. Yorkie being alive is okay because the rest of the Ramba pirates, mate, they are definitely dead. We've seen their remains quite vividly as well, so the flashback doesn't lose anything. And just briefly on the remains of the Ramba pirates, something morbidly hilarious is that it's always played as a gag that Brook still has his hair because the afro is very firmly rooted, but he isn't even the only member of the Ramba pirates who kept his hair after death. There was also a member named Mizuka Madaisuke who wanted Brook to teach him how to use swords, and when Brook depressingly stumbles upon his body, it is seen with a sword jammed through the skull. Very poetic and such, dying by the thing it is that he wanted to do. Peak fiction. And it's also a shot that got censored in the anime to a stab in the back because the sword in the skull was deemed a bit too visceral. There are people on the internet who insist that the One Piece anime has no censorship, and if you're people, then you're wrong. In any case, Brook picks up Madaisuke's head, and would you look at that, it still has an almost full head of hair. And then there's a shot of all the Ramba pirate skulls being collected and piled up, and I know it's a depressing as crap flashback, but it always makes me laugh just a little bit to see Madaisuke's skull in the bottom right hand corner with that full head of hair. And also his name, Madaisuke, literally means I like dots, and it's why he wears a dotted shirt. And he also had a twin brother named Mizuta Mawariyotsuki, which means dots aren't bad, and he also wore a dotted shirt. There are people on the internet who insist that One Piece isn't a goofy pirate comic, and if you're people, then you're wrong. But as it is, Yorkie being alive might be too much to hope. Even if at any point Oda did have something in the works for this, it is possible that these ideas will be cut or streamlined for the final saga of One Piece. However, at the very least, I wouldn't count out a possible epilogue appearance by a very familiar Yorkie-esque face seeing an article about Brook, musician of the Pirate King, and set sail to reunite with his lost friend of half a century.